a couple millimeters long to giants that have heads swollen with muscles that bring the powerful jaws together. They vary, the casts vary from one to the other. And within that caste system, we see organized an assembly line operation that converts fresh vegetation, pieces of leaves that are cut, or stems, as shown in the photograph, gradually transforms that bit of vegetable material step by step into a pulp on which, in the depth of the nest, the ants are able to rear a specialized fungus that occurs only with them, and they live on the fungus. They also drink some plant sap, but generally speaking, they have become so successful because, like we humans, some 10 to 12,000 years ago, they discovered agriculture.
Interesting. But it's interesting that you say the ants look very different, even though they're the same kind of ant, because of the division, the caste system.
The interesting thing about this, the point that Bert Hölldobler has already raised, is that they're genetically the same. But what has evolved in evolution is the plasticity of the expression. In other words, one gene, one form of a gene even, can result because it is plastic in the way it's expressed. And it differs in expression not by differences in the gene, but in differences in the environment, such as food, temperature, so on.
Which will determine how the ant develops.
Yeah, in very primitive expression. If you're given an awful lot of food when you're very young and there's not a pheromone, a chemical signal, which is telling the colony not to raise any more of your kind because, okay, we got enough of them already. If you have those conditions together, then you might, from that single genetic constitution, produce a huge soldier or a tiny little worker. It's, well, an example that we can use, and I'm talking too much, but an example that I think makes it immediately understandable is the lily. That form has three forms. Same genes, but if you make the lily grow underneath the water, it forms things like eelgrass that can, long slender blades that can move back and forth with the current. If you let it grow on the surface of the water, it forms lily pads. And if you let it grow out of the water, then it forms the arrow leaf characteristic of the species.
That's a wonderful analogy.
Yeah, so it's the, if you think that analogy and place it with the
what about, though, the reproductive element? How can that, I mean, when you were speaking about, Bert, earlier, about the ultimate superorganism, you said that it pivots on the notion of reproduction. Some workers are not reproductive. They simply are workers. They're workers. They're not reproductive.
As a rule, all. Right.
How can that be passed on? I mean, that seems to be a contradiction from a Darwinian point of view.
That's right.
Could you explain that?
Well, it's very complicated. It's very complicated, and it's very hard to explain with a few sentences without avoiding to confuse people. But you know, this state where you have the workers not reproducing at all and only the queen reproduces, is highly advanced. And we would have to go to really explain how this comes about. We would have to go way back to the very primitive state, the beginning of eusociality, to explain it. Because you cannot explain it by using these tremendous superorganisms. But you can say the following. The queen has the same genes as the workers, even as a tiny little worker. But again, in the queen, other genes are expressed than in this worker. Now, all these workers have the genes from the queen and her mates. The queen mates and carries the sperms of the males, which are long gone. They die after mating. So the workers are, in a way, the extended phenotype, the appearance of the queen. So the queen gives these genes to all her millions of workers. However, the genes expressed in the workers are not expressed in the queen. So and this is where you come closest to a real superorganism. You have one unit, the sexual unit, which has all the genes. And she gives all these genes, and of course the genes of her mate, this is often forgotten, to the workers. But the workers express genes which the queen does not express. So you see, the queen has its genes, but she
by
doesn't
express, manifest,
showing
use
that
them.
she doesn't show it in her phenotype. But the workers don't show genes which the queen shows in her phenotype, in her appearance. So this is why I say now you can really talk about a true superorganism.
So we're thinking about the whole, this is the equation that you draw between an organism, well, how a superorganism is like an organism. It's more like an organism than any of the individual members are like an organism.
You know, you could talk about our brain has the identical gene than our skin cells or the liver cells, but different genes are expressed in the brain cells and in the skin cells. And this is, you can, of course, the workers are not identical genetically to the queen, because the queen gives only one half of her genes and the other half come from the male sperm. It's the queen.
So are you saying, is the reproductive element plastic in the same way that these other caste elements that we discussed before?
They're only plastic as long as they are, let me take again a comparison from the true organism, as long as they are in the quotation mark stem cell situation. This means for superorganisms, the larval stage, the larvae. You know, after the eggs, out of the eggs develop larvae. The larvae go through 5 stages, and the more they, you know, the first 1, 2, 3 stages are still very plastic, and then they become more channeled. So when they have reached the large stage, they are not very plastic anymore. Either you become a queen, a young queen, or you become a gigantic worker, a major, or you become one of these tinies, minis. And then they pupate, and when they come out of the pupa, this is the adult individual. The small worker will not grow to become a large worker. They can only grow during the larval stage. Now, I have to say one word, because I'm now at Arizona State University. There are also leafcutter ants in Arizona, not just in the American tropics, and in Texas.
And you've seen them there?
Yes, but very rare. But there are some leafcutter ants, of course, notice, which are adapted to a semi-desert climate.
I want to continue. I mean, you use the term, I don't know if you coin it, but the term an altruism gene for the certain ants or insects that do not reproduce but could reproduce. Is that the idea?
Okay.
I guess I'm not clear about this.
I know what you mean.
Why do you use this term, altruism gene?
We, as you probably realize, we use it not very often in the book. What we use is a sib care gene, a sibling care gene. You know, that, to make it very simple, actually all scientists now agree, although there is a little bit a controversial issue, agree that this eusocial system evolved from a parental care system. So some wasps show parental care. These parental care genes are expressed in a particular stage of the wasp. First, she flies around, she builds a nest, then she lays eggs, and once the larvae are there, these genes which code for parental care are expressed. Now, how can you imagine how such a system evolves very primitively, that such a primitive eusocial system occurs? Most likely, no one knows exactly how, but most likely these parental care genes are expressed prematurely in the offspring of the mother. And now, instead of taking care of their own offspring, they take care of the siblings, the next generation of siblings. This all occurs, of course, only if the ecological pressure favors those groups where sisters remain in the nest and raise other sisters, and that they are more successful, these groups, as say another individual of the same population, same species, which tries to do it alone as a parental care thing. So if the ecological situation is that such a social system, primitive eusocial system, eusocial means now a daughter stays home and helps raising sisters. If this is favored by selection, ecological selection, then this SIP care genes, which will spread,
So in those cases,
and the other ones will actually not make it.
So the individual, the typical Darwinian survival of the fittest for the individual will not prosper. It's the group identity that
Sure.
will.
Darwin said in his book, Origin of Species, that he couldn't figure out why ants are altruistic. Then his whole theory was kaput. I think he was exaggerating, but nonetheless, he stated that. So he spent a lot of time worrying about ants.
Yeah.
And there's a story about how Darwin is at Down in his home outside London. He's a close neighbor of William Makepeace Thackeray, the novelist, and he's sitting there in the garden outside the house, staring at an ant colony for long periods of time, watching them and thinking. And an elderly retainer, a lady in the house, sees him and finally says, "What a pity Mr. Darwin cannot find something to pass the time like Mr. Thackeray."
On that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Ed Wilson, Bert Hölldobler, this has been a fascinating interview. And I want to thank you today for joining us at the Drexel interview.